Although there's much to be done to help the national mammal recover and reestablish native prairie ecosystems, which I think we've heard a little bit about, this panel that we've got together today was going to help us to provide some perspective on approaches that are being taken and potential future moves that may be beneficial to moving the success of the bison on the northern plains, I'll call it that way, forward. Each member of our panel is going to have an opportunity to sort of speak to the return of the bison from their perspective. And then we'll open the conversation up to include you. We've got quite a bit of time, like almost an hour and a half. So we've got 3 folks that are going to talk, and then we'll break into a little bit more time. If we get done early, there's all kinds of other things to do too. So Larry's getting them water. I'd like to introduce Arnell Abold, an enrolled member of the Oglala Sioux tribe, been appointed to a position of business development. Is that the current one? Okay. These folks have all changed their jobs. So it's 2 years in COVID makes, anyway, business development director at the Tonka Resilient Agriculture Company, also known as TRAC, and Tonka Fund Company. Also, we have Kevin Lear, the executive director of the North Dakota Bison Association. He joins us from Rugby today, and he has a bison herd. So if you want to talk with him about stuff, he can talk with you. How's that? Isn't that right? Can't you do that? And Brendan Moynihan, research coordinator. Is that the one? Is that the right one or an old one? Whatever. Yeah, and a science advisor for the National Park Service. And Brendan chairs the Department of Interior's Bison Working Group, which is a group of folks that work in different areas of the Department of Interior to coordinate things related to bison development and ecosystems and things like that. And so this is our panel. Join us. Come on, you guys can do it in whatever order you want.
Karaoke time is starting early, Arnell.
You do not want to hear me sing.
I'm not going to sing.
Yeah, I guess I can talk about stuff.
Yeah, there you go.
So my name's Kevin Lear. I kind of wear a lot of different hats within what I would say is the commercial side of the bison industry. My family is originally from the Rugby, North Dakota area, so kind of north central North Dakota. We lay claim to the geographical center of North America, which is kind of fun. We got into bison in 1996. My dad grew up on a small grain and cattle farm in North Dakota, left the state in the 80s like a lot of people did, and then in the mid-90s we moved back as a family and got into bison right away. That's all I've ever raised, actually. Since 1996. I'm now the second generation on our family farm, our ranch, and my sons and daughters will probably, hopefully, eventually take that on and move forward. So growing up in the bison industry and looking at it from more of a commercial side of how do we raise this animal and how do we raise this animal with the respect that it deserves, but also in a holistic way that improves the land. And what I found is as I've grown up in this industry, a lot of producers in that, in kind of the greater North Dakota or Dakota Territory region very much have that same mindset. How are they raising these animals with respect, but how are they also raising these animals to improve the land, because bison is a keystone species. As I've gotten older, I became involved in the regional associations. So North Dakota and South Dakota both have a regional bison association. And then I just got elected as the secretary of the National Bison Association based out of Denver, Colorado. So bison is something that's very near and dear to my heart. And it's interesting listening to so many different perspectives in the world of bison, because there's a conservation side, there's a tribal side, and then there's this idea of commercial side. And what we try to do and try to promote from both our ranch and the associations that I represent personally is how do we engage consumers to understand the many benefits of eating what we call America's original red protein. a grass-fed bison is probably one of the most nutrient-dense pieces of red meat that you can actually consume in the world. It's an amazing thing. How do we bring that superfood back to the consumer? And how do we do it in a way that's also good for the land? And that's a big part of that. So that's a little bit about me and some of the stuff that I do. And I'll pass the torch over.
Well, thanks to Eric for putting this panel together several years ago. And I'm thrilled to finally be here. It's actually really nice to see everyone in full high definition and 3D. I think Eric did a really great job of assembling some diverse perspectives. So just as we heard a little bit of an introduction from someone who's going to represent and speak to the commercial perspective, I'm here to bring the federal conservation perspective. And so my name's Brendan Moynihan. I did just move into a new position, so now my position is chief of the Wildlife Conservation Branch for the National Park Service. It's a Washington office job, but thankfully, one of the great things about COVID is that people have found that we can do our jobs pretty well remotely. So I get to stay with my family in Missoula, Montana, where I'm based. I've been my initial exposure to bison was when I first traveled out to Montana when I was probably 18 years old. And I traveled to Montana because I was chasing a Montana girl who hadn't let me catch her yet. And she lived in Missoula. I've caught her since. She's my wife now. And just north of Missoula is the Flathead Reservation. And in the dead center of the Flathead Reservation, at that time, and for about 100 years, was the National Bison Range, which was part of the National Wildlife Refuge System. And that was a place where we spent a tremendous amount of time. It was kind of an anchor wildlife experience for us, and it was one of the core places where we'd bring family and friends who came to visit. And of course, now the National Bison Range has been brought back into tribal management. It's now managed. There was an official ceremony just a few weeks ago to finalize the dedication and have it brought back into tribal management under the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and there's an incredible history there. But after several jobs in the National Park Service in Colorado and a number of years in Alaska, I had the opportunity to come back and work as a supervisory wildlife biologist at the National Bison Range. And I was there for a few years, and I was part of the team that prior to the return of the bison range to the tribes through legislative action, I was part of the team that was making one final run at trying to come up with a cooperative solution, an arrangement, an agreement between the federal government and the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes to have a strong tribal presence in management of the National Bison Range. We can talk more about that. That could be a whole 3-day session right there. But after a few years in that job, I came back to work for the National Park Service and started coordination first within our Intermountain region, which spans from Glacier National Park to Big Bend in Texas. And then that quickly expanded to include some bison coordination between our Intermountain region and our Midwest region, which includes the Dakotas and 3 of our crown jewel bison parks, Badlands, Theodore Roosevelt, and Wind Cave. And since then, I've also joined on and become the chair of the Department of Interior's Bison Working Group. And that group had been, it's been around for about 14 years now. It's a collaboration between the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the U.S. Geological Survey. And that group was initially set up to really just foster coordination and communication among those 5 bureaus that all have a connection to bison management and bison conservation under the Department of Interior. Interestingly, that group was put up on blocks for about 2 to 3 years after the 2016 presidential election, when all manner of internal advisory groups were told to stand down when the new administration came in. But when it became reinvigorated in 2019, we were just finishing up about a 10-year commitment to complete a number of really foundational science products that were assigned to the Bison Working Group by virtue of the initial charter that established the group in 2008. And the final piece of that was something that we point-ahead scientists call a population viability analysis. And it was a big genetics analysis and demographic analysis that essentially recognized that managing these relatively small, very isolated federal herds in isolation perpetually is not a good idea. And any producer could have told us that in a heartbeat. And any biologist knows that to be the case as well. But nonetheless, the way government works, we needed to get the scientific underpinnings in place in order to enable a big change in direction at the ground level, at the individual herd level. Once we finished that product, we suddenly got the attention of then Secretary Bernhardt in 2019. And we had an opportunity as that administration was facing election to demonstrate a commitment of that administration, of the Trump administration, to a conservation issue. Bison stuck. And with completion of that population viability analysis and some press coverage of that, there was kind of a ripe moment to do something. Initially, the secretary, I found myself on a Friday giving a conference presentation on the population viability report, and the next Monday, I was on a one-on-one call with the secretary, who was asking what we were going to do to conserve bison. Initially, they were interested in having a few small demonstration projects. Could you just move a few bison around and show that we care about addressing these issues of isolated herds? And we said, well, yeah, we could do that, but wouldn't it be great to do something bigger than that? And what we were able to tee up was all this thinking and work that had been assembled over the last 15 years of the Bison Working Group, but came from, to be fair and honest, decades of work by tribes in particular, and also federal and state agencies to be part of this next chapter in history that we just heard about. And we had this strange moment where, having completed some of these fundamental central science documents, we had set the stage with partnerships with folks like Arnell and tribes across the country. We had set the framework of discussions with individual herd managers at national parks and national wildlife refuges. We had adequate science, and suddenly we had the attention and support from the highest levels of the federal government to do something. So what were we going to do? We took the lessons of the previous 10 years of the Bison Working Group, and we pitched a new 2020 Bison Conservation Initiative. The short version of this story, believe it or not, this is the short version, is that we assembled a team and we put together this brand new document that sets the roadmap for how the federal government is going to move forward on bison conservation into the future. And I'm thrilled to see the variety of presentations this morning, and especially to come on the heels of that historical perspective, because there's a tendency, I think, for us to always look behind us, look retrospectively at what people did before. And in that context, the contextualization that our previous presenter talked about, that Drew talked about, is really important. But nonetheless, we can be informed by that and also ask ourselves, if this is our moment in that continuum, and it is, what will we do? What are we going to do? So we ask ourselves that, and I'll just highlight for you the five central goals of the Bison Conservation Initiative. It's a short document. If you Google it, you'll find it online. It's about 6 pages. It's very readable. But the 5 goals are to continue the department's commitment to conserving wild, healthy bison herds. So this is the conservation side of things, and it distinguishes the roughly 12,000 wild bison and conservation herds from the roughly 500,000 or so in production herds in the country. It continues our commitment to doing our best work and committing to the science of conservation genetics over the long term. It makes a commitment, and this is a new direction, to embrace and develop shared stewardship of conservation herds and looking for new opportunities that don't have to be federally controlled, that advance shared stewardship of bringing bison back, wild bison back to the country. And we recognize that, looking back on history, we can absolutely celebrate and should celebrate that the bison as a species, as an animal, as a evolutionary unit, is secure. We have accomplished that goal. What we haven't done yet, and we've barely begun to scratch the surface on, relates to these next 2 goals, and that is that we need to actively work to advance ecological restoration of bison. And as important, hand in glove, we need to advance the cultural restoration of bison, both for indigenous peoples and for the American public, with bison as the national mammal. So those are the 5 goals and a little bit of an overview of where right now the federal government sits on approaching bison conservation. It's about making sure we do our best work internally for our scientific advances. It makes sure that we recognize that all successful, durable conservation is going to come through partnership and collaboration. And it recognizes that securing the animal is not nearly enough. We need to commit ourselves to ecological and cultural restoration of bison to North America.
Wow. That was a lot, but really great. Good afternoon. My name is Arnell Abold. I grew up on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation and have, I guess when I went to school in college and I ended up in Florida for a few years and I came back home, had no idea how connected to the buffalo I would become. I took a position with what was then known as the Intertribal Bison Cooperative, and as their finance director. In that right there, you see everything. You see where the funding comes from, what it's for, why we're doing it, what's happening with it. You meet all the different parties involved in all of these different scenarios. And I was with Intertribal Bison Cooperative, who eventually became federally chartered in 2009 as the Intertribal Bison Council. Geez, a year goes by and you forget. I'm so sorry. COVID did it. Yes, that's my brain. Anyway, throughout the years, I worked with so many different tribes and leadership and met many great partners. I was the director for Intertribal Bison Buffalo Council for 4 years before leaving about a year ago. The goal was, of course, is to return buffalo to tribal lands and to the people. And that, was initially always a cultural and spiritual initiative, which eventually, you look at economy, economic development, health initiatives, educational opportunities, community involvement. So it just became just a round table of many different initiatives and issues that would come up. Through all of that, we worked with Department of Interior, National Park Service, the Nature Conservancy. Some of the bigger things that we did, we were able to, how do we get animals to our tribes? We worked with the National Park Service. We took their surplus, and we were very fortunate to get many animals and distribute to many different tribes and help them start herds. For whatever their reasons are, every tribe is different, why they want their buffalo back. And I would almost guarantee most of it is a foundation of spirituality and bringing back your culture. But there's a lot of different avenues. You do have to feed your people. You have to keep your community connected, all of those different things. I learned a lot in 20 years. I was very grateful for that. I think some of the things that came out of that, I realized that partnerships are key to moving forward in any situation, whether it's with the Park Service or with another tribe or an individual producer. How do we make this keep rolling forward? So after a year ago, I actually took a position in November with Tonka Fund, which is basically a nonprofit based out of Kyle, South Dakota. Now that is pretty much the same, runs about on the same foundation as Intertribal Buffalo Council, except we're working with individual tribal producers. And that is kind of fun in the fact that now we're looking at, I get to go out there and I get to meet with private producers, and we try to help them. We become a resource for them. We do funding and granting to them to help with their infrastructure, whatever that would be. Ideally, we want to bring in more animals to them, make sure that they're getting some genetic diversity in there. And a lot of them all want to grow their herds. They want to become, be a part of the community, to serve the communities. They also want to grow and be producers and put, economically, can they sell out in that market? So those are some of the things we are looking at as well. What is it they're looking for? Are they looking for grass-fed, organic, or, those types of things? We also look at processing, which seems to be the biggest thing we realized over time. COVID made us realize that our food is very important, especially when it comes to our communities and our people. And how do we help grow that within those communities? And looking at processing, you would be amazed when some of these producers couldn't get their animals into process. 6 months on the books, 8 months out. They're just struggling. And so, they would have to go to their barns and process animals to donate meat to some of their members. So there's there's definitely some big avenues out there that we're looking to push forward, and we're excited to be able to help producers. And we want to look at youth initiatives to bring the youth on, because on average, most of our producers are in their 50s. Who's going to take over? Who's going to be the next in line to step up and grow our economy and to work with our communities and to ensure that our people are fed? But that's kind of where I'm at. It's been fun. I'm excited about it. And thanks, Eric, for inviting me.
That gives us some idea of who these folks are. But I wanted to ask a question that sort of comes out of what I heard from the two of you. Brendan, the public science side to support the private range side, how is that information going to be able to be disseminated effectively to help Kevin and his people, or Arnell and the people with the Tonka Fund, to understand the environment and the different cultural things that you are working with? And can you sort of address the dissemination of that a little bit?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So all the scientific material that we're producing and the management guidelines and strategies are all they're published when completed. So that material exists. It's easy to locate. In fact, Eric and I just talked when we met over lunch about some emerging bison health concerns, and I let him know that we were kind of trading notes on this bacterium of major concern for bison conservation right now, which is Mycoplasma bovis. Some folks have probably heard of that. If you haven't, you probably will very soon. It's a disease that's common in production cattle herds, but generally doesn't have notable or discernible negative effects on cattle. In bison herds, when it does establish and break out, pretty rapidly you can see 30, 40, 50, 60% mortality. And you typically don't know that it's there until animals start dying. So we were comparing notes about things that he's doing and that we're doing on our side. For the federal government, we're making some pretty substantial investments right now with partners at research institutions, in particular University of Wyoming, to do a couple of things. One is to general research to better understand the disease and pathogen dynamics. And then the second part is much more applied, which is to try to help spearhead efforts to develop a much more reliable rapid test for live animals. So you can detect it in herds and in individual animals before you run into big problems and before you ship animals to partners. We certainly don't want to have a role in spreading that disease. So those sort of efforts that we're spearheading from a kind of a bison health standpoint will be freely available when they're developed. On the genetics side, all that work will be published as well, and I'm really excited that as we're developing what we call a metapopulation strategy, and a metapopulation is just a big word for a collection of populations, or in the case of bison, it's the idea that you may have a number of individual independent herds, but you manage them in such a way that they're connected. So you move animals occasionally from one herd to another. We're developing a metapopulation strategy for the Department of Interior herds, and as we're developing that, we're also creating space for there to be non-federal conservation partners to that strategy. And the obvious partners right off the bat are a number of tribes that have large herds that they themselves manage. I mentioned the National Bison Range earlier, now the Bison Range managed by the Salish and Kootenai tribes. I'm thrilled that we were, over the course of the last year or so, during their transition planning, I was able to keep some of the contacts that I had from having worked at the Bison Range, and we were able to invite the tribes and have their tribal council accept the invitation for them to remain as a full-blown partner to our metapopulation strategy. So that's our first non-federal, our first tribal partner to that plan, and I suspect there'll be many more to follow.
I guess a follow-up question that I was wondering about, maybe you can address this one, Kevin, is there a move afoot for the land-grant colleges that are doing cattle-based research or anything, thinking about bison development? And if not, are there ways that the people in this room could be politically active and say, NDSU, get your act together, this is bison stuff?
So this is the irony of the situation. If you're not from North Dakota, you would know that NDSU and SDSU, there's quite the rivalry between those two colleges, the Jackrabbits and the Bison. Unfortunately, NDSU lost out to NDSU or SDSU, which has now established the Bison Center of Excellence, which is kind of hilarious living here. But so the Bison Center of Excellence is actually based out of Rapid City, South Dakota. Rapid City is kind of the mecca now if you think about a lot of bison general things. There's a lot of privately owned herds. There's also some public herds close by, and then there's also tribal herds. So that's where they decided to put that, and they are very much, they're funded well right now, I would say. They're going to probably in about 2 or 3 years, they're going to be looking at another round of capital campaigning to build that fund back up as the research continues to roll in on what different things are really starting to threaten bison in general. So I've personally been a part of our ranching operation has been a part of a couple different research projects that have been fielded through that Bison Center of Excellence. And every year, I know the University of Wyoming has done some work with them, but they are right now kind of in the infant stages building up an actual research center that's focused primarily on bison. So yeah, it's coming.
Other questions from the audience? We've got a mic down here, and Larry's got a mic that we can pass around if, otherwise I can create questions for forever. We got one up there.
Back in the
turn it
late
on.
70s.
Wait, turn it on.
It is on. 1, 2.
Okay, so talk at it.
Back in the late 70s or early 80s, there was a...
Hold it up.
They're not hearing you.
Oh.
There we go.
Back in the late 70s and early 80s, there was a big push on what they call cattle. And what has happened to that, and how much of that cattle DNA is into the wild herds now, if any?
Yeah, so I can answer the part about the wild herds, the conservation herds, and then you might want to add some more. So yeah, that's a legacy of, it's really a legacy of the conservation story at the turn of the century, the previous century. A little quick thing, about a year ago, I was having a breakfast with my 12-year-old boy, and we were sitting down on a Saturday morning talking, and he looked at me, he got quiet all of a sudden, and he looked over at me and said, "Wow, Dad, I can't believe you were born in the 1900s. So I got to be clear which century I'm speaking of. But in the early 1900s, where I come from, as part of this conservation story, some of the folks that brought in some of the very last wild buffalo were ranchers. And there were some concerted efforts to crossbreed bison and cattle. They didn't take very well for a couple of reasons. One is just the physical mechanics of the two animals. They don't crossbreed very well. Also, the first generation, males in particular, tend to be sterile, or are essentially always sterile. But it did happen in some cases, and that is something that we can detect with new genetics techniques. So there are two types of DNA that we're concerned about with the conservation herds. One is mitochondrial DNA. It doesn't code for a whole lot other than likely some physiological processes. It's not something that would drive, size or shape or temperament or that sort of thing. But it's only inherited matrilineally. So it's a record of female lineage, female origin lineage. Nuclear DNA is the part that we all get 50-50 from our mother and father, and that is what is the manual, the instruction manual for coding for everything that we look like and act like and feel like. So in the conservation herds, we now, as techniques get better and better, you can detect smaller and smaller levels of cattle introgression or cattle DNA in the bison genome. And we now know that in essentially every herd you look at, and virtually every animal within every herd, if you look closely enough with these current techniques, which are exceptional, you can see that signature of cattle DNA to a very small degree everywhere. So that's in the nuclear side. That's the part that really matters. The mitochondrial side is what we typically look at for understanding some of these evolutionary trees that we saw earlier with different species of bison, the branching trees. That can let you look retrospectively and see track essentially evolution and times over many generations. And so to answer your question, on the nuclear side, the really important stuff, the maximum that we see in federal herds is on the order of 1.5% of the total genome using old generation techniques. We're now updating that research to look more closely with the next generation techniques. On the mitochondrial side, virtually all herds have 0% cattle DNA. And some of that is because of how different herds originated. Some of it is because efforts were made to purge cattle DNA from animals that were known to have had a connection to a crossbreeding effort. So.
Yeah, so I can talk about it kind of on the commercial side. So if you look at industry standards, so if you were to look at like the Code of Ethics from the National Bison Association, it is an industry standard not to breed or crossbreed those two things. Are there people who do it? Yes. Those people are highly frowned upon because they're diluting all the good things that come from a native or a natural occurring bison. And that's what we want to raise. So there was kind of a phase, and some people still try to do it, where they'll cross, usually it's a Charolais, and they'll cross a Charolais onto a bison because they're trying to get a white buffalo. You know, I'm a student of history, and specifically Native American history. I love that, to learn as much as I can. I think it's almost sacrilegious, in my opinion, when they do things like that, because they don't understand the significance of a white bison to Native peoples. So there's a large number of producers that are in the bison industry that are what I would call purists. They want bison to be as pure as possible. They DNA test for cattle integration. If they have animals that are showing cattle integration, those animals are called out, and they're continuing to breed for purity. So that's very much active in the private herds. Yeah.
So one more thing about that, and this is a really interesting separation between how conservation herds look at this integration issue and that description of purity on the production side. On the conservation side, we have decided, and we meaning scientists who argue about these things, federal bison scientists have decided, and in essentially to complete consensus, that cattle integration is so low that it would be potentially much more damaging to bison conservation to cull individual animals to try to purge that last 0.5%, 1% out of the herd. Because in order to purge that 0.5% or 0.1%, you have to purge the rest of that bison's animal, right? You can't, I'm sorry, that bison's genetics. You can't just purge that little bit that you detect. And you don't ever know whether that bit that you detect actually does anything. And so we've decided that it is much, much more valuable to retain as much as possible of true wild bison genetics than it is to try to chase purity as a goal, as an objective.
We got 2 or 3 other things here, unless you had
Well, I live very close to the North American Bison Co-op in Rockford, North Dakota. A lot of my neighbors have bison, and I drive by them a lot. I never really see them doing much of anything other than sitting, or they're walking around grazing. Once in a while, you'll see them roll over and do the wallow thing, but the bison that I see in the middle of North Dakota, they seem a little small to me compared to when I go to Medora. How much difference is a New Mexico bison, a Montana bison, and a North Dakota bison?
I guess I can kind of take a stab at this. Generally, it's distance from the equator. The further north you get, the larger the bison structure is. And we even see that even in private herds. And it has a lot to do with environment as well. Like personally, I can speak to you bringing an animal out of, like, from where I'm at. If I go 6 hours into Canada and I were to buy an animal up there, because there are private producers up in Canada, that kind of that prairie land that extends up there. Typically, you'll see them. They're a little larger framed. They carry a little more weight, but they also, their hair follicles are denser. And like, especially in the wintertime, they hair up big time because it's colder climate. You get to our place, it's a little bit less. You get further down to Nebraska, Kansas, northern Texas. Those animals are a little bit smaller framed and they don't hair up quite the same, but typically that's a product of their environment from what I've seen as a private producer, yeah. And just for a frame of reference, like an average bison cow on a private herd would probably be about 1,100 pounds. An average bull is probably somewhere around 2,000 to 2,200 pounds. I've had bulls that are like 2,600 pounds, and they'll toss a small car pretty easily.
Yeah, and even that cow size is real similar to what we see in our wild herds. Those bull sizes are a lot larger than what we see in our conservation herds. A very large bull would be 2,000, maybe 2,200, but they're probably averaging around 1,700 or 1,800 pounds.
Kevin, I thought they were talking about your miniatures up there, but the gentleman talked earlier about the genetics of different types of cows. Dr. Durr out of Texas A&M, pretty well known for buffalo genetics, looking at, and he could go back quite a ways down the line, and you'll find that you'll have Angus, Charolais, Herefords. I think the last one they found was like a Jersey cow, where people try to make the super animal back in the day. And like you said, Kevin, it is against a lot of associations, ethics to even go that far anymore. They don't allow that, even to the back in the day castrating to make a bigger steer. So he is right. There is different genetics out there. Again, Yellowstone, pretty much, he mentioned Badlands, Wind Cave is another one. And again, from Standing Rock, we've received pretty much from all of those already, and they're pretty strong in 96 to 100%. Yellowstone, coming out of Yellowstone, they're pretty well purebreds. So, although you still have mixed in there from the past. So, again, I just wanted to talk about Dr. Deere when he out of Texas A&M. He's kind of a professional in that area of finding cow genetics in buffalo. So he is right. Back in the day, they have tried to put a super animal together. People are fighting against that now. So good discussion.
There's this discussion makes me think about where I started to go with some of those opening comments, and that is that we spend a lot of time on the federal side, putting in a lot of effort on making sure we had our conservation genetics planning down really well, and we're just that point now where we're putting that into action with strategies for how often to move animals from one herd to another, which direction would they go, so that you can augment the bison diversity, but you don't make the cattle integration any worse by moving from a herd of higher integration to a herd of lower integration. But all that genetics part is, that's easy. It's complicated, it's complex, it's technical, but it's easy. The hard part is conserving wild bison and getting them on the landscape accessible to people. So, and when I say wild bison, I'm thinking of, there is one herd in the United States that, well, first of all, every single herd, whether fenced or not, is constrained geographically. Even Yellowstone. Animals out-migrate in the wintertime, and some are trapped and go into a quarantine program, some are trapped and go right to slaughter, some are hunted under treaty rights. There are a few animals that are taken under a state permit process, but those animals are not allowed to exercise that historic migratory pathway. And that is the one place in the United States where bison coexist with the full complement of the predator community and wildlife. So that's the one place where you have bison with grizzlies, with wolves, with mountain lions. And that natural part, that wild part, is really what we're after with the Department of Interior herds. And it means things like not inoculating or vaccinating in general. Now, if there's an emerging disease that threatens to wipe out a herd or a large portion of it, yeah, we'll act. But it also means not manipulating sex ratios so that you allow for that annual rut cycle to occur, and you have competition for breeding, which itself drives conservation genetics processes. It includes things like not manipulating age class distribution, for example. It includes things like when we're going to move animals and we have the opportunity to perhaps establish a new herd, you pay really close attention to as much as you know about the social dynamics, the social structure of bison herds, which is incredibly complex. So the genetics part, yeah, it's interesting. It gets a lot of attention. Some people talk about purity. I cringe every time I hear the word purity related to bison. I don't even, I'm much more interested in the hard work, partnership work of getting more wild bison on the ground and having them accessible to state license hunters, to tribes through cooperative management, and accessible to the American people for visitation, viewing, and preservation of bison as wildlife.
First of all, thank you for allowing me to ask you this question in a good way. My name is Les Thomas. I'm the Vice President of the North Dakota Native Tourism Alliance, and we recently accepted the award from the Governor's Trailblazing Award. And I'd like to acknowledge Chairman Mike Faith, who just asked a question before this, past chairman, and he's been part of all this through our time putting all this together. And all the tribes here in North Dakota are part of this organization, the 7 tribes out of the 5 nations. MHA is 3 tribes. But Sisseton and Wahpeton has developed purebred, 2 different herds. So I don't know if you're aware of that. That's what I was going to ask you.
I'm not aware of it, but I don't know what that would mean, because up until about a month ago, when Jim Durr published that most recent paper on bison integration using the next generation techniques, so SNP analysis and whole genome sequencing, there were 2 herds in the United States that were frequently called pure, and those were Yellowstone and Wind Cave. And with that new analysis, you know, as these new techniques develop, it's like moving from naked eye to a pirate's telescope, to a good telescope, to binoculars, to a microscope. And we're at kind of at the level of like an electron microscope. And that analysis showed some detectable amount no matter where you look. Now, that's like mathematically detectable, technically detectable. Is it functionally important? Probably not. So I guess the short answer is no, I'm not aware of that.
Well,
But I have more thoughts on it.
yeah. Please check on that, because like I said, you should see the size of their herd, and the bulls are huge. I mean, when they were talking
I suspect they're
size,
probably called that because they're Yellowstone origin or wind cave origin.
That's what I was going to say.
Are you aware of that, Mike?
Not over there, no. But again, if they're keeping a separate herd, for the purpose of strictly going towards the percentage of, going towards 100% pure, and then using the other one for marketing, I guess, it's up to them. We have two pastures too down at Standing Rock, but again, we mix them up with the genetic purposes so we don't overload on bulls. We move bulls around, different cows for the genetic purposes, actually, for anything else, so we don't start overloading on one size. So I'm not really familiar with Les's question or comment.
I think one important thing to keep in mind when we talk about this purity topic, and then I really hope we can move on.
I'll move us on.
I'm joking. I'm happy to talk more about it. I don't mean to disparage the questions because they are important, but
Right.
but I think it's a small part of what the challenge is for bison conservation. You can have a population that is technically pure, that doesn't have any detectable cattle genes in a bison herd. And then the question is, are you going to manage that herd under artificial selection or natural selection? And under natural selection, you would do things like we do in the national parks and national wildlife refuges. You're going to keep, strive for, roughly equal sex ratios. You're going to look for a diversity of age classes. You're going to look for competition for breeding, predator communities, all the things that drive natural selection. You could also have a pure herd that is driven very, very far in a different direction through artificial selection. And that doesn't mean that you interject cattle genes into them. It just means that you only select for the largest, most docile, fastest growing animals. And I'm not suggesting that's what producers do, but I'm trying to set the sideboards on how different the outcomes can be under that umbrella of purity by how you choose to manage them.
So we've got a empty chair over there, and I had really hoped that the fourth voice of this would relate to the sort of ecosystem that these animals live on through the Nature Conservancy and others like that. And so although the person that I had hoped to have here and the guy from Cross Ranch, neither were able to be here today, if you guys could speak a little bit to maybe both multiple different ways that the ranges are either positive or negative to the health of the animals, both commercially and in the private herds, and particularly I think on the reservations where there are large pieces of maybe unfenced land that are hopefully being positively regenerated perhaps by bison being on them.
Yeah, so when we talk about buffalo running on tribal lands, essentially I think tribal lands, there is a lot of land there. A lot of it is unfiltered. In other words, it doesn't have pesticides or anything like that. It's very good, strong organic land, soil and all of that. But when you have buffalo running across it, it also helps, kind of regenerate grasses and medicines, as we call it, depending on where they're at, just because of their hoof and how they imprint into the soil. those are ideal situations to have buffalo. I think somebody was talking earlier, I can't remember, about, when you're running cattle, how deep and how they wear a path into the dirt and basically wiping out your plant system, whereas a buffalo does not do that. Some of the things that we talked about, one of the reasons why Tonka Fund looks at trying to help tribal producers look at markets of grass-fed or organic is because we do have really beautiful land and beautiful soil. They don't get a lot of interaction with other things. So it sounds ideal, but getting there is always pretty tough. We are thinking that because of what we have we have tribes and they want to raise animals, the issue comes with our land base. Where fractionated lands, allotments, it's very hard to grow a large herd when you only have so much land to work with, unless you can get leases. So there's lots of competition for leases on tribal lands, and so that's where some of our catch-all comes from. We struggle for that a lot. So when leases open, people bid on them, and it's a tough competition. And then you also have whatever the tribe's resolutions are related to cattle and what those range units need to have on them. When you purchase that, when you actually get the lease, sometimes you're required to be able to put animals on them right away. So it depends, do you have the buffalo or not? Or do you have to put cattle on them? Or is this strictly for cattle lease only? So there's lots of different things in that regard when we're looking at helping develop herds and helping producers grow their herds. And it's different in every tribe, because you just don't know what you're going to end up with in the end. But there's lots of momentum right now for regenerative agriculture. We're pushing hard for different things, creating that, food security and food sovereignty. But to get there, you do have to have that land base.
Yeah, on the federal herds, we have the luxury that tribal and commercial producers and non-tribal commercial producers don't, which is that we don't have to turn a profit or demonstrate sustainability, economic sustainability based on production of the herd. So each park and refuge approaches it a little bit differently. Some parks and refuges do have range assessments, and they have a very ballpark estimate of trying to allocate roughly a third of available forage for bison, roughly a third for other wildlife, from elk and bighorns down to hoppers, and a third to leave for ecological processes. And one of the things that we're really interested in and exploring as we complete this metapopulation planning and understanding how to maintain genetics and not have all our eggs in one basket for a particular lineage or genetically distinct herd, is that quite a few of our public herds occur in areas where that are outside of the core of the Great Plains, and they're in areas where we've now been sustaining bison herds year-round on relatively small acreages for 100 years or more. And buffalo probably were never in those places year-round grazing for 100 years at a time. And so we have some opportunities, I think, in the coming years to learn a lot more by applying a more experimental approach with how we have bison in some of these locations.
I think from a private rancher standpoint, when it comes to regenerative agriculture, that seems to be kind of a trending thing when you hear it out in the marketplace, and people are really good at taking things like that and then marketing to consumers like this is a regenerative, whatever. When you look at bison, bison are a keystone species in the prairie ecosystem. And so what that really means is that in order for the prairie ecosystem to be a fully cyclical system, you have to have a large herbivore that's grazing that grass. And bison did that for centuries in North America. And so when you look at the short to mixed to tall grass prairies, the development of those prairies were centered on the fact that you had large scale herds of bison that would congregate in even larger herds like the past speaker talked about. And that impact on the ground would be huge. You know, if you read historical context of people who came west and saw these massive herds, you know, they would leave an area and it would be, you know, just this big dust trail, black. Well, those bison would never come back to that area because there's nothing for them to graze there. Again, they weren't confined by fences or geographical boundaries, so those big herds were able to move, and that impact on the soil created this very virgin, lush prairie. And so as a private producer, my job now is to try to understand that natural cycle as best as possible and then mimic that on our ranch through, you know, a design. And so like Alan Savory has a really great book called Holistic Management, which really pushes the idea of regenerative agriculture, and sometimes they'll call it high impact grazing, but you're using the animal as a tool and its intention to you're regenerating that actual soil. And by regenerating the soil, everything above the soil is therefore going to regenerate as well. So it's a very important thing that we're looking at. I know a lot of people are starting to understand just, you know, how much that 6 inches of topsoil really plays into the evolution of mankind, you know. And if we I can't even talk right now. If we totally eliminate that, we're going to be in big trouble. So how do we start to really understand it and then put it back into practice? So that's what we've tried to do.
Another question. Around Yellowstone, there's a lot of discussion about brucellosis getting off the park and into the cattle herds. How much of that is real and how much is imagined? And two, I think Kevin can vouch for it, but I think NDSU has rewritten Webster Dictionary as far as the pronunciation of the word. It's bison, not bison.
The closer you get to the Canada line, the harder the Z becomes. Yeah, or the Z, I guess. So on the brucellosis question, it's almost entirely political. Bison, you're welcome. Bison in the greater Yellowstone area originally were exposed to brucellosis and contracted brucellosis from cattle. So it didn't originate within bison. And now, so two things, two considerations that will, I think, help explain what I mean when I say it's almost entirely political. The Yellowstone Conservation Transfer Program, which is called it's the quarantine program, is incredibly effective. The only problem with it is that the process takes years and requires land and facilities, so that the volume, the flow of animals through that quarantine program is pretty limited. But it's a multi-year, 3-phase process that's prescribed by states, feds, and tribes all working together. There's never been an animal that has initially tested negative for brucellosis that has then subsequently tested positive later in the quarantine process. So that quarantine process is tried and true. It's only been in place for a handful of years, so we're learning a lot. It will probably be tweaked over time as information grows, but it's incredibly effective at reducing that risk. And then there's kind of the exposure risk issue. So the Brucella bacteria is actually highly prevalent in wild elk in the greater Yellowstone area and even beyond. And seasonally, elk and cattle have a lot more direct opportunity for direct contact and overlap than do elk and bison. I'm sorry, cattle and bison. So elk and cattle operations are often calving in the same lowland areas in the late winter, early spring. At that point, the bison have generally started to migrate back into the park. And so there's spatial separation there as well. But elk are, support a huge, huge economic engine of the hunting industry. And the State Fish and Game Agency gets a huge proportion of their operational budget from license sales. So this issue is well enough known that it's debated fairly hotly, but it's a lot quieter than you might think. And the brucellosis is only present in that greater Yellowstone area. So the Yellowstone in bison, in bison in Yellowstone, Grand Teton, and the National Elk Refuge herd. It doesn't occur anywhere else. And so there are 19 total federal conservation herds, and it's an issue in 2 of them in the same geographic area.
I think if I remember correctly, I don't believe there's even been a documented case of where bison have transferred brucellosis to cattle at this point. I worked with Intertribal Buffalo Council, and we were a big part of those transfers for Yellowstone going into quarantine out on Fort Peck. So we definitely had a big hand in some of that, and that was one of our big things. It is all political. Very tough.
Yeah, Brandon, maybe the whole panel can answer this one. Here in the state of North Dakota, tourism is the 3rd largest economic engine. So what role does the bison, buffalo, play on the national level with tourism?
I don't have numbers on the national level, but I can tell you that from experience with parks and refuges and the bison range, that seeing wild bison is the number one thing that people who visit parks with bison want to see, above wolves, above grizzlies. There's something about this animal that is, it's almost it's almost not enough to say that they have iconic status. There's something about the animal that is so deeply connected to American identity and mythology and history and ideas of strength and resilience and purpose and wildness that people seeing wild bison are very often transformed by that experience. And so it's a huge, huge driver in that regard. It's not all about opportunities for commodity production or a hunting opportunity or kind of a monetary value that's like a direct purchase value. It's a huge draw for many millions of people, and national parks and wildlife refuges are seeing incredible increases in visitation these last few years, and it's only going up.
I was just musing about the sort of the spiritual power of bison and how that maybe transcends cultures some. If you've been near them or have put on the glasses up there and been in the herd, or if you want to walk out the far end of the building and go up toward the Capitol and stand near the statue that stands out there, you can get the power. It's there. And I think that that's an important part of it. Why do I care about the bison? Why am I involved in this? I worked at Fort Clark Historic Site in the 1970s, and that place was there because of the buffalo hides. It was being traded. and the Mandan peoples there were bringing in those robes, and so there's a long connection. I think, as all of you know, you wouldn't be sitting here listening to a whole day and then a bus trip and everything else if you didn't see it. So I think, to get to your point, Les, exactly, is if we talk about how important the bison is to us, tourists from other places will see that, and it'll resonate with them too.